this to coincide with the AASB starting tomorrow as well. At the start of the year, I knew I wanted to organise something for COGS to celebrate Maggie. And then when I was asked to organise the AASB as well, I thought that was a perfect opportunity to do both together. So I was really lucky when I started my PhD to be able to attend Maggie's open lectures in History of Cognitive Science, which was an amazing series of lectures and really set me up for my trajectory since then. And I'm still, I think, learning things about Maggie's thoughts that I didn't quite realize were important then, and I do now. And I think, it's quite clear, becoming more clear how far ahead of her time she was, how difficult she was to pigeonhole her ideas, things that she said, which at the time maybe seemed a bit not like things anyone else was saying, now becoming much more relevant. So, whether she was a computationalist in a kind of old-fashioned strict sense, not really, because she talked about the importance of biological concepts as well as computational ones. So she prefigured the 4E embodied in activist kind of approaches as well, I think. And when I still read things that she wrote in her prime, and I still think it's worth reading and it's relevant to debates that are happening now. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's memories and thoughts about her. And now I teach here. I teach the history of cognitive science, and of course, I teach it with Maggie as one of the key figures in that history. That a lot of it happened here at Sussex. So I'm really happy to be organising today, and really looking forward to what everyone's going to say. So I'll start by handing over to the first person on the list, Dave Cliff, who's going to be giving Maggie's unexpurgated obituary without any censorship.
That's right. All the swear words.
Great. I'll just sit here and look after things.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Dave Cliff. I was here from 1987 when I started my PhD to 1997. I was here for 10 years, and then I went off and did other things. And a couple of days after Maggie died, I heard from Yvonne Rogers, who's speaking later, that Maggie had passed, and I was very sad to hear that. And I just thought, well, she's bound to get an obituary in The Guardian. And a day passed and no obituary was published, and 2 days passed and 3 days. And it got to 9 days, and I just thought, what's going on? So I emailed obituaries at The Guardian and said, why is there no obituary of Maggie Boden? And they said, would you like to write it? And I didn't know that this is how obituaries work. So The Guardian have a policy that family members are not allowed to write a dictionary. But The Guardian checked with Ruskin and Jahan, Maggie's son and daughter, and they gave the thumbs up to me writing it. And then I said to The Guardian, can I have co-authors, please? Because I didn't feel uniquely qualified to be the arbiter of Maggie's record in The Guardian. And they said, well, you can talk to other people, but we only ever want one name or at most 2 names on the author list. So I wrote a draft, and I shared it with Yvonne, and I shared it with Ben de Boulay, late of this parish, and I shared it with Dave Hogg, late of this parish, and his wife Alex, who had studied as an undergraduate with Maggie. And I also shared it with Jahan and Ruskin, the family, and they gave me lots of details. And then The Guardian said, keep it to under 1,000 words. But as more and more people were contributing, it got longer and longer, and it was about 1,800 words. And then Hulk Hogan died, and Hulk Hogan got 1,800 words in The Guardian. And my view was, if Hulk Hogan gets 1,800 words, then Maggie should get at least 1,800 words. But no, I submitted my 1,800 word obituary, and they cut it quite heavily. So the reason why this reading, and I am just going to read the words out. Sorry, I should have kind of composed some montage of images from Maggie's life, but I only thought of that 10 seconds ago. So So what I'm reading out is what I sent to The Guardian, and which they then butchered. No, actually, I think, in fairness to them, what they published was succinct, and it kept all the major things that we wanted to say, and it kept the spirit of the style in which they were said. But here goes, and I'm just going to read this as I sent it to The Guardian. Professor Margaret A. Boden, who has died aged 88, was a trailblazing British philosopher of cognitive science who devoted her professional life to exploring and extending the philosophy of psychology and artificial intelligence, or AI, and to leading the creation and growth of the School of Cognitive Sciences at the University of Sussex, a uniquely interdisciplinary crucible in which the careers of many prominent AI researchers were forged, including my own. Oh yeah, The Guardian asked you to make it personal. Talk about how you knew the person. So that's my excuse. Right. Central to all of Maggie's work was the study of mental phenomena such as perception, thinking, consciousness, and creativity, and how they arise from what are ultimately nothing more than mechanistic interactions, either biochemical reactions within the brain or binary digits shuffling around the circuits of a computer. Over her career, she wrote 15 books as sole author, co-authored another, and co-edited several collections of essays by others. Her works have been translated into 20 languages. Her first book, Purposive Explanation in Psychology, published in 1972, was revised and extended from her 1968 Harvard PhD thesis. There, she first advanced the novel argument that AI programs could be viewed as a type of theoretical psychology, allowing for the rigorous study of mental processes in abstract, non-living systems, with the ultimate aim of revealing principles that could help us better understand mental processing in real living beings. That book was very well received, but it was her second book that propelled her to global prominence and established her reputation as a world authority on AI. Published in 1977, Artificial Intelligence and Natural Man was a 537-page tour de force critical review and analysis of pretty much all progress in AI research up to the mid-1970s. It was presented to the reader in entertainingly and accessibly non-technical terms. It's sometimes referred to as the world's first book on AI, and the only other book that I can find that might contest that claim is Patrick Winston's Artificial Intelligence textbook, which was published in the same year. In the closing part of her book, Maggie explored the extent to which various types of AI system could be useful to advancing our understanding of human psychology. She discussed the philosophical issues raised by advances in AI and pondered on the potential social significance of the increased use of AI technologies in application areas such as education, law, healthcare, and in creative acts such as composing music or writing poems. Much of what she wrote then, half a century ago, remains very relevant today. The issue of creativity in living and artificial systems was a topic that Maggie returned to repeatedly over the course of her career, extending her surveys and constructively critical analyses in books published in 1990, 1994, 2010, and again in her most recent book, From Fingers to Digits, An Artificial Aesthetic, which she co-authored with digital artist Ernest Edmonds in 2019. But she in no way limited herself to one topic. Her other books include a concise summary of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget's work, several on AI as theoretical psychology and on computer models of mind, a 1990 book, The Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence, followed in 1996 by her edited collection, The Philosophy of Artificial Life, and her truly masterful two-volume set, Mind as Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, published in 2006 and spanning almost 1,700 pages, with a bibliography running to more than 4,000 entries. As Maggie noted with her characteristic candor in the introduction to Mind as Machine, she set out to write it as an historical essay, not as an encyclopedia. This magnum opus was explicitly offered as her one-person view of cognitive science as a whole. I can think of no one else, living or dead, who could or would have the depth and breadth of knowledge to even conceive of such a sole-authored project, let alone the writing ability and sheer stamina to pull it off with such aplomb. Maggie started her academic career in 1959 as a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. After spending 1962 to 64 as a Harkness Fellow at Harvard, she moved to the University of Sussex. In 1965 as a lecturer in philosophy and psychology, rising to full professor in 1980, a post that she held until 2002, when she was appointed as research professor in cognitive science, and that was the title that she held for the rest of her life. In 1974, Maggie, her philosopher colleague Aaron Sloman, and computer vision researcher Max Close jointly initiated Sussex's Cognitive Studies Programme, or the CSP. This was a radically novel attempt to bring together psychologists, linguists, philosophers, and AI researchers to collectively work on the study of mind. Over time, the CSP unit attracted an inclusive gaggle of academics, all keen to explore research questions at the outer borders of their fields, where their areas of expertise intersected with other disciplines. Over the following years, research funding flowed in, computers were purchased, postdoc researchers and PhD students were recruited. An undergraduate degree in psychology and computer models was launched, followed by a master's degree in knowledge-based systems. And by the mid-1980s, Sussex's Cognitive Studies Programme was widely recognised as one of the two major centres for AI research in the UK, in friendly competition, for the top spot with the University of Edinburgh. By then, the CSP had grown so large, and Maggie having led much of that growth, that in 1987 it became the autonomous School of Cognitive Sciences, known internally as COGS, the first new school at Sussex since its inception, with Maggie as its founding dean. Maggie was determined that the new school would continue the traditions of the CSP, and central to that was a commitment to creating and maintaining an inclusive and collaborative community of interdisciplinary scholars, something that Maggie invested considerable effort in, focusing her attention primarily on developing early career researchers and academics. In the years that followed, COGS absorbed Sussex's Computer Science Department and was renamed the School of Cognitive and Computing Sciences. And then in 2003, another reorganisation led COGS to be renamed as the Sussex Centre for Cognitive Science, which remains to this day as a group of more than 50 academics drawn from across the university's 4 faculties. In 1983, Maggie was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy, serving as the Academy's Vice President during 1989 to 91. In 1993, she became a Fellow of the American Association for AI. In 2001, she was appointed an OBE for services to cognitive science. In 2017, she received the ACM AAAI Alan Newell Award. And in 2018, the University of Cambridge's Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence established the annual Margaret Boden Lecture in her honour. Maggie was born in London, the only surviving child of self-educated civil servant Leonard Boden and Violet Boden, whose premarital name was Dawson. Their first child, Keith, had died aged 6 months before Maggie was born. In 1958, Maggie graduated from the University of Cambridge with a prize-winning first-class degree in medical sciences. It was there that her lifelong interest in mind and brain was first sparked. Maggie made no secret that she chose to study at Cambridge rather than Oxford because she just could not abide the dark blue colour of Oxford's sports uniforms, and she very much liked the light blue of Cambridge. She said that to my face. Maggie married John Raymond Spears in June 1967, and they divorced in 81. Her son Ruskin was born in 1968, and her daughter Jehan in 72. Maggie's beloved grandchildren are Byron, Oscar, Lucas, and Alina. In her vacations, Maggie had a long-standing love for the Cook Islands, spending 6 weeks there each year for almost 30 years. She loved the drumming and the dancing, and was for a long time a keen snorkeler. It will surprise no one who knew her that she also became an accomplished scholar of Polynesia. I spent 1987 to 1997 in COGS, joining as a PhD student and ending up as a lecturer. It was a place like no other. Maggie and her colleagues had created and sustained a true multidisciplinary academic environment, something that many institutions aspire to, but very rarely achieve. Despite her international reputation and her packed schedule, Maggie was immensely supportive to me, just as she was to very many other early career researchers. I think personally she saw in me a potential that I certainly never saw in myself. Maggie's remarkable energy is something many who met her will never forget. She shared it generously, not only with her colleagues, but also with her undergraduate seminar groups, bringing the same intellectual precision and passion to their explorations in her Minds and Mechanisms module. Maggie was an incandescently brilliant, fearless, iconoclastic, no bullshit, welcoming, warm, and funny human being. She was passionate and compassionate, a stratospheric intelligence combined with a very big heart. She had an unquenchable thirst for conversation, intellectual debate, and above all, laughter. She was forever adorned with unique jewelry and was always dressed in purple. The Guardian challenged that. They said, we found 2 photos of her not wearing purple, so we're cutting that line. It's no coincidence that the predominant colour used in COGS, and in fact I noticed the seats here, for its brochures, technical reports and official academic gowns was purple. They should call that Boden purple, shouldn't they? That's not in there. Yet beyond all of that, time and time again, she selflessly provided the launch pad, the rocket, and the fuel that enabled embryonic academic careers to take flight, mine included. Her lasting professional legacy will not be solely the insightful academic arguments that she advanced so eloquently in her books and papers. It will also be all those people, and we are many, long since flying solo, for whom, one way or another, Maggie gently pointed our gaze to the sky and quietly helped us to reach for the stars. That's it.
Thanks, Dave. That's fantastic. Next up is Ernest. Let me get the slides. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so as you just heard, I'm Ernest Edmonds, and I knew Maggie for a long time and worked with her. I met her in many places, including, as this picture indicates, just beside Sydney Harbour, which she liked very much. And I have to say, following on from her obituary, that she enjoyed shopping for the correct colour in jewellery in Sydney's shops. And in a way, that's one of the things I remember most about her being in Sydney. Oh, was it? Oh, okay. So, yeah. So my friendship with her terminated when we lost her. But the last real act we did was we produced this book together, which is really about her work on creativity in the context of visual art. She was very serious, but she dealt with these serious matters in a very light-hearted way. And I have to tell you that when she came up with the title of this book, From Fingers to Digits, she made me swear not to mention it to anyone until it was published, in case they stole it. So she was, I think that the thing she was proudest of in this book was the title. Okay, so my time with her began back in, whenever this was, 1976, was it? Six, yes. Interestingly, at an ASB meeting, which I organised in Leicester, called Human and Robot Behaviour. Now, that sounded a bit like scientific, but actually it was bringing together artists and particularly roboticists and others to discuss these matters and what was shared across the arts and the sciences. And so right from the beginning, she was there, interested in and talking with creative people. And I think this is the most important thing I want to say altogether about her approach, which is it might look, when you read some of the text, as very kind of academic and theoretical, but it was grounded in actual creative activity as conducted by experts in their field. She was friends with artists, she talked with artists, musicians, writers, and she knew many of them. And so her theoretical work was deeply grounded in the practical work of creative people. And so it's more her thoughts, her theoretical thoughts, are more justified by practice than the texts themselves claim. When I met her in that 76 meeting, it was just to say hello and good to meet you kind of thing. But it was in this meeting in 1991 when we became friends and worked together. And this was a creative meeting in a creative place. So this was in a national park in Australia, where we could walk from the conference to a cliff, which was the border between Queensland and New South Wales, and peer from Queensland into New South Wales, watching eagles fly beneath us. And she, like others, found this very inspiring for her thinking about creativity. She was the keynote speaker at this meeting. And I was another speaker. And we met and started to talk a lot because we agreed with one another, as it turned out. But we each said things that the other didn't quite understand. And so we had to talk, and we did indeed talk as we walked to look at New South Wales. So this was her role at this meeting. So already creativity was an important aspect of the work that she was doing. And she was contributing to that in an interesting way. I'm going to show you now, while I talk, a set of slides of artworks that came from her collection. And when she had to leave her home in Brighton towards the end of her life, she donated this collection to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And these slides are of images that are in that collection. Mostly, they're by the artist Harold Cohen. We will find there's just one by me, so I just got to look in. The rest are Harold's. I chose to show you these slides for you to contemplate because this is the strongest example of the grounding of her theoretical studies. Her conversations, particularly with Harold. Harold Cohen was, in case people don't know his work, a couple of words. He was an artist who was represented Britain in the Venice Biennale before he ever met a computer. So he was like a very successful artist who, in the late 60s, discovered computer programming. And he felt at that time that his work was a bit stuck, so he was kind of like repeating himself. And he wanted to understand more about what he was doing and where it could go. And he realized that writing computer programs about his work would help him think about that. And the thing he famously said was he was the artist who could produce new work after he died, because he embodied his thinking about how to make an artwork in a computer program. And in theory, you could run that computer program after he died. And in a way, that's happening because his son has reconstructed that program and has run it and produced new work. So in a sense, that really did happen. And so it was in debate with Harold that I think much of the ideas developed. And it's interesting that the things go two ways. She's famous in our community, obviously, and quite widely famous. But I was at a meeting yesterday with a bunch of artists, musicians and poets, okay? No cognitive scientists, no scientists at all, except that with one hat on, I could say I'm a computer scientist. But we were discussing novelty as against creativity. And I mentioned Maggie's views on this, her theories on this matter. And I was about to explain those ideas when I discovered that they all knew. In other words, she is famous in the creative community too. And they all knew about her work and her ideas and kind of thanked me for mentioning them because people had forgotten to refer to them in an earlier discussion. And I think that's very impressive and important to understand that her reach was very wide, just like the breadth of the origins of her thinking. So there was the breadth of the outward results of her thinking being communicated. She was also very strong-minded. And I remember when we were, some long time ago now, looking for someone with philosophical expertise to work on a funded project. And she and I were composing an advertisement. And she said to me, do you think we could get away with putting in the advertisement, no French philosophers? We couldn't get away with that. However, we didn't appoint a French philosopher. When we were looking at creativity in the visual arts, one thing that was also very important for her, which was different to much thinking in the art world, I'm pleased to say, she was very much right, was that she was thinking about the process, not the products. So she wasn't analysing artworks. She was analysing the creative process, which is why talking to artists was a critical matter in terms of trying to understand that process. So that alone was a contribution to the visual arts. However, her work was applicable across the arts. So music was as important to her as visual art. She was fond of quoting one of Harold Cohen's comments that people are consumers of algorithms, not composers of algorithms. And the creative person is the composer of algorithms. So she distinguished, as Harold did, between those two classes of people, the creative people. So this book that we did together was very largely about writing software. It was about creative arts, but when you dug into it, it was really about writing software. And I interviewed 10 artists, and the interviews are in the book, and that was all about how they wrote software and how that impinged on their work. And one of those conversations was actually a three-way conversation, because it was with Harold, and Maggie was there, and the three of us were in conversation. A second visit to New South Wales, to Australia, that's it. Okay. It's okay. Here we are on the coast. You see the colour of the dress is different to what we were led to believe might be the case. She enjoyed this. Of course, this particular spot where she was then was not far away from Ruskin's home at that time. And so she was able to combine visiting me and working, doing stuff in Sydney with family pleasures. I think the happiness that she had was itself creative, so that she took joy in her investigations. She took joy in coming up with ideas about what creativity was. And actually, although this wasn't part of her formal academic work, in trying to understand what helped people be more creative and what hindered them. And certainly in conversation, she was full of ideas about what was important in that respect. Something that's very important to teachers. This bunch of people I was with yesterday were academics, and they were much concerned with the teaching of writing, creative writing, painting, and so on. And we discovered in that discussion that Maggie's understanding of creativity that she brought to us, and the challenges that she made of theories about creativity, was very helpful in trying to understand how to teach people, how to facilitate people's creative thinking. It was a great pleasure for me to be able to say something about her and to pay tribute to one of my best friends and one of the people I admire most academically. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Ernest. There's a bit of a feedback on there. Don't know how to turn that down. Yeah, don't want to press anything, but okay. Yes, thank you, Yvonne. Thanks for sounds like we're ahead of schedule.
Great. Good morning. It's lovely to see so many faces and people I haven't seen for years. And it's great to be back at Sussex. I joined COGS in 1991 as a junior lecturer. And in the first few weeks, I came across Maggie in the ladies' toilets. And she was larger than life as she walked towards me, and I was terrified. What was she going to ask or say? But she said, Yvonne, I've been meaning to talk to you. And she said, would you like to run the COGS seminars? And I had no choice, of course. And so I did, and I got to know Maggie after the COGS seminars. A group of us, sometimes quite a lot of us, would go to Ashoka in Hove and just have those nice conversations about what the speaker had talked about. But I also got to know her a bit in the debugging room where she held court, I've got to know her really much better after my partner Mike Scaife died rather unexpectedly and suddenly. And she reached out to me and invited me to her house for dinner. And then when she couldn't be bothered to cook anymore, we went to terre à terre. And we used to do this about 3 or 4 times a year. And it was during those dinners that I encountered her storytelling on a one-on-one. And she'd start by regaling stories about her aches and pains, but then would switch to tales from the past. And she would gossip about certain professors and their shenanigans, especially those who had crossed her path. Her voice would get louder and her eyes would light up. And her laugh, Dave has already mentioned that, but her laugh was so infectious. It had such gusto. I can still hear it now. At the time, she was deeply immersed in writing Mind as Machine as a single author, which I recently went back to read. It was on the slide earlier. And in it, in the introduction, I noticed she wrote, "My account is focused on ideas, not anecdotes. It's not about who said what to whom over the coffee cups. Nevertheless, the occasional coffee cup does feature. Sometimes a pithy personal reminisce can speak volumes about what was going on at a certain time." And her written storytelling was not as gossipy as her oral storytelling. Instead, every now and again in the book, she would add a backstory about what was going on behind the scenes in cognitive science in the early days, and the feuds, the jealousies, and the joys that were part of the rich tapestry of the academe at the time. I think in doing so, she brought alive the history of AI, of philosophy, and cognitive science, making it very human. If you look at some of her headings and subheadings, they're a bit ambiguous, they're quite clever, and at times mischievous. And that captures, I think, Maggie to a T. But what it did is it makes you want to read on. It's a page turner, even though it's 1,500 words. It is, I think, a wonderful book, a single author of cognitive science. So as an example, I want to draw your attention to Maggie's entry for Doug Hofstadter, who I know she was very fond of and in awe of, and would have a twinkle in her eyes whenever his name was mentioned. He was also a professor at Indiana University, where I went after I left Sussex in the early 2000s. And so I happened to get to know him a bit and his children, and he was a legend and still is in Bloomington, Indiana. Maggie wrote with great affection about his classic book, which I'm sure most of you have read or have on your bookshelf, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, which was published in 1979. She describes it in her book as an extraordinary intellectual and rhetorical feast. It really tickled her fancy. She talks at length in the book about how she went to great lengths to get the book published, as it was so original, so out there, so left field in some ways that most publishers would not touch it with a barge pole. And she was right. It turned out to be not a cult book, not just a cult book, but a bestseller. And it was sold worldwide, translated into many languages, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. Maggie could see a like-minded soul in the making. And I think Maggie, as Dave already mentioned, was that she was very supportive of people she thought had a career in front of them. And she supported several of us at COGS, including Andy Clark early on in his career, and Dave and myself. And I think that's an important part of who she was. She even went to great lengths to try and understand my research, which is nothing to do with philosophy. It's to do with human-computer interaction. And at the time, I set up the Interact Lab and worked on my theory, which is about external cognition. And much to my joy, there are 3 pages in her book about the work we did in the Interact Lab. She read papers and she talked to me at length about what I was trying to do, and she got it. And that was great, really wonderful. So I want to just finish by mentioning the stories Maggie told me about her times in the Cook Islands. As was already mentioned, she loved the Cook Islands. She would go there, she would let her hair down, and she would just be relax and enjoy the pleasures of snorkeling, of dancing, of drumming, of eating and drinking and so on. And I was coming back from Australia and she said, Yvonne, you must go to the Cook Islands. And I did. And I could see what she saw there. And everyone I came across there, just when I said I knew Maggie Boden, they went, ah, Maggie. And they just loved her. She had this wonderful life there. And that's how I will remember Maggie, with such joy, such support, and being a very, very special person to us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. The Mike Sharples. Yeah. Good morning. I'm wearing my Cogs t-shirt. I've kept it for 40 years just for today. And it's faded a bit in the water. It used to be a lot more purple. I first met Maggie Boden in 1984 when she acted as external examiner for my PhD thesis on cognition, computers, and creative writing at the University of Edinburgh. It was a somewhat traumatic event. She gave me a thorough grilling and then asked me to make corrections, including adding a couple of paragraphs on the relevance of Piaget to my work. In my naivety, I thought I'd failed the exam. And then, to compound my woes, I was invited to dinner that evening. I sat amongst distinguished academics who discussed something they called Searle's Chinese room argument. I hadn't the faintest idea what they were talking about. All I knew was that it was deeply contentious and very Chinese. The next day, I decided to become a proper academic and never get caught out like that again. When I moved to the University of Sussex, Maggie Boden became my leader, mentor, and colleague. She offered a supportive context for me to gather a group of master's and PhD students to explore computational creativity in the area of story generation. Rafael Perez was a PhD student at that time, working on a program to generate stories about the ancient Mexicas. He's now a professor at UAM in Mexico and a former president of the Association for Computational Creativity. Here's how he describes Maggie's influence. I want to highlight something less tangible, yet deeply significant. Her legacy as a role model. Our dreams and goals are shaped by those we look up to. At that time, I had not previously had the chance to interact with someone of her qualities. Maggie gave me that experience. Working alongside an international scholar, a strong and determined woman, recognized worldwide for her contributions, showed me what was possible. This is a legacy that leaves a lasting mark. The actions of our role models, their attitudes, the way they face problems, the way they interact with others, create a conceptual space, to use Maggie's words, that allows us to explore our own potential. Those were the words from my colleague Raphael, who I hope and believe is watching online. A creative conceptual space was central not only to Maggie Boden's understanding of mind, but also her approach to research. Her founding of the School of Cognitive and Computing Sciences was a triumph of creativity. It brought together in one physical and intellectual space philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, computer scientists, and linguists. Its debugging room was a nexus for conversation. Each Wednesday afternoon, the school would gather for a work in progress seminar, where researchers would argue with passion about artificial minds and autonomous robots. First-year undergraduates took a compulsory course in computers and thought, where they discussed creativity in humans and machines,
and wrote programs to simulate psychotherapists. Cogs was a cauldron where Nouvelle AI was brewed. It wasn't a product, but a creative cybernetic system. And it couldn't last. Even at Sussex, founded on self-consciously interdisciplinary vision of redrawing the map of learning, there was a pressure to normalize, to retreat into the disciplines. Maggie's achievement wasn't just to create that conceptual space, it was to hold it open for as long as it did. The other attribute of Maggie Boden that I experienced, and I want to emphasize, is care. I looked up the origin of the word care. It goes back to Proto-Germanic, excuse my pronunciation, Proto-Germanic charo, meaning grief or lament. Itself thought to go back to a root meaning to cry out in sorrow. Maggie could certainly do that. In 2007, 3 academics reviewed her monumental 2-volume book, Mind as Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, for the journal Artificial Intelligence. In 2008, she responded to those reviews. This is her abstract of that response in full. This is the author's reply to 3 very different reviews of Mind as Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, volumes 1 to 2. 2 of the reviews, written by Paul Thagard and Jerry Feldman, engage with the book seriously. The 3rd, by Noam Chomsky, does not. It is a sadly unscholarly piece, guaranteed to mislead its readers about both the tone and the content of the book. It is also defamatory. The author provides appropriate responses to all 3. And she did. Her response to Chomsky was a cry of academic sorrow. In her work and her life, Maggie Boden also embodied the modern descendants of Charo, careful and caring. She was careful in her academic writing, though not quite so careful in the emails she wrote. And she cared for her friends and colleagues. And more broadly, she cared for exemplary scholarship and for human engagement with AI. In 1988, she chaired a working party for the Council on Science and Society on the social implications of AI. The report, and I've got it here, if anybody wants to read it. The report, for which I was rapporteur, was prescient. Nearly 40 years ago, it covered automated teachers, AI-based stock trading, autonomous vehicles and weapons, and AI literacy. In 1992, she gave a series of lectures on social implications of AI. In the announcement for that series, she wrote, "The role of AI is controversial. Some see it as a utopian promise, others as a nightmarish threat. Its social effects will depend partly on what it can and cannot do, and partly on what we choose to do or misguidedly try to do by means of it." Those words are even more relevant today. I want to propose that care, in all its meanings, is central to how we as individuals and as a society engage with AI. Much has been written about the need to be careful in interpreting the outputs of generative AI, to check facts and limit persuasive information. Much less has been written about caring an AI. An AI can compile and maintain a profile of anyone who interacts with it. It can reference your history and your needs and your wishes in its response. It can adapt to you over time. But what grows over time is a representation, not an exposure. AI has no vulnerable self, no solidarity of care. Caring with someone rests on mutual risk. A system that risks nothing is a performer, not a carer. Generative AI offers care by design, attentive, beguiling, solicitous. Maggie Boden gave me a tough PhD viva, not because she was trained on examples of PhD exams, but because she cared from her lived experience of becoming a respected academic. Creativity and care are exactly what puts modern AI under pressure. Generative AI can display creativity through its mapping and exploration of vast associative data spaces, but it lacks the causal and inspectable model of how the world works that's needed for transformational creativity. And AI displays representations of care without jeopardy. AI has not faced the hard labor of becoming. In Maggie's case, of becoming a greatly respected female academic. If an AI provides a representation of care but not a lived experience of it, then what does that ask of us? If the machine cannot bear the burden, then we must. Maggie's 1992 warning still holds. The social effects of AI depend less on what it can do than on what we choose to do by means of it. To use it well is to take pains, to check, to question, to refuse the easy deference its fluency invites. That is care in its oldest sense, trouble taken because something essential is at stake. Maggie has already shown us how to build for care. COGS wasn't a machine for producing answers. It was a conceptual space in which philosophers, psychologists, and computer scientists argued, disagreed, and cared about humans and machines. So could we imagine a new 21st century School of Cognitive and Computing Sciences where people and machines together argue with passion about the benefits and risks of a post-digital world, where human researchers build models of creativity, where AIs write stories about their experiences on the web, and where robots act out the social implications of embodied AI? Yes, all that is entirely imaginable. But for it to flourish, a 21st century COGS would need to be founded not on productivity and efficiency benchmarks, but on radical creativity and mutual care. It would be a place to build inspectable models of mind and society, to explore transformational creativity with AI, and to determine not only what AI can and cannot do, but also what we choose to do with AI to make a more creative and caring world. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So the final part of this first session is Steve. Put some slides.
Okay, another photo of Maggie. Okay, so my name's Steve Torrance. I think I'm holding the record, at least this morning, for going back the furthest. So my memory of Maggie goes back to the late 1960s. So we both joined the University of Sussex at the same time. I was an undergraduate. I studied philosophy, and Maggie joined as a lecturer in philosophy and psychology. I remember her striding purposefully across the campus, striking a very forceful figure. And this is roughly how she was then. I don't know the date of this, but it was in the inside pages of the document that accompanied
our send-off to Maggie last August. I couldn't resist reproducing it. I remember a Philosophy Society paper she read in 1968, when the year I graduated, entitled Intentionality in Machines. I was really puzzled about that. I couldn't work out that it just seemed like a total kind of contradiction in terms. Intentionality was a code word in philosophy for mentality. So, what on earth was she talking about? So the environment at that time, philosophically, was almost totally innocent of computational models or AI as part of the discourse. The idea that machines could be considered as potentially displaying mental properties or modeling them baffled me, and I think quite a lot of other people. I don't know how many others at the time understand now what she was talking about. People have mentioned mind as machine, and Maggie refers to, in the preface to that book, the wonderful preface, to one of her early published papers, Intentionality and Physical Systems, published in Philosophy of Science in 1970, which linked to her talk on intentionality in machines. I'll be weaving my own recollections with some of hers in that preface. In the years leading up to the start of her long time at Sussex, it's clear that her theoretical and hands-on relationship with machines was pretty revolutionary. As people will have read, she got a top first-class degree in medicine at Newnham, then went on to read philosophy, also known as moral sciences, at Cambridge, and joined the language research group under the direction of Margaret Masterman, a namesake, who was a machine translation pioneer. Now, just another little thing about that 2-volume work. People have already talked about its monumental nature. Just a taste of that. The bibliography, which is at the end of volume 2, stretches 133 pages from page 1453 to page 1586. It sounds like one of those roads in California. So years before I knew her as an undergraduate at Sussex, and I didn't know her very well, I was somewhat in awe of her, I must say. Maggie, who had already been working with early computing devices at Cambridge, and then afterwards, when she went to Harvard on the Harkness Fellowship, she worked with machines there, very primitive, I guess, punch card machines. And she was in the Center for Cognitive Studies, founded by Jerome Bruner and George Miller. I can't resist an anecdote that she gives. She was introduced by Bruner to Miller as, "Here's our double first from Oxford." And she politely corrected Cambridge, actually, Cambridge, UK. To cover the embarrassment, George Miller immediately shot back with, "Welcome to Yale." Anyway, at Harvard, she worked a lot with the various giants there. And in particular, she says that she came across the book Plans and the Structure of Behavior by Miller, Galanta, and Prybram. And some of you here may remember that book as a classic of the time. And she said this book changed her life. And maybe we're the beneficiaries of the change because of all the things that have come since. Now, the work that she was doing at that time was organized around a deep and multi-stranded set of cognitive and growing computational conceptions. McDougall, who's been mentioned, was the subject of her PhD thesis in her first book, Purposive Explanation in Psychology, the book that she referred to as her purple book. And at the time, it was probably the only one, but later on it got joined by a few others. By the time she got to Sussex in 1965, Maggie had already had several other papers published. She'd had one in mind in 1959 in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society in 62 and in the Journal of Philosophy in 1965. So already by this time, she was a well-published academic. It's just astounding considering, what's come since and just how much she had already achieved by that her first steps at Sussex. Later on, after the Cognitive Studies programme was set up, Maggie was a regular attender of the debugging room. I think someone had already mentioned that. She wasn't sitting there debugging code, looking over reams of printouts like most of the people feverishly taking time off from their misbehaving programs. But she was there to socialize, to discuss, and to exchange. Well, when I was first at Sussex, I didn't know her too well, as I said, but I knew her formidable reputation. A few years later, I encountered her again when I was a lecturer at Middlesex Polytechnic. A number of people who had been students at Sussex during my time there gathered at Middlesex to form a large philosophy department. It was so large that someone asked a question about it in the House of Lords. Why is this public money being wasted on a large philosophy department, bigger than everywhere else in the country, apart from Cambridge, it appears? Well, colleagues at Middlesex included Jonathan Powers, who's in another photo, which I'll show in a minute, and Mark Fisher, who was a lecturer at Sussex who decamped to Middlesex, possibly because the pay was better at a polytechnic than it was at a university in those days. It shortly dipped relative to university salaries, I'm afraid. Now, as you can see, various people were at Sussex and then at Middlesex, so there was quite a lot of sex change going on. Perhaps that's not the sort of thing I should be saying at Sussex University at the moment, but anyways. Because of the strong connection with Sussex of colleagues there, Maggie was invited to become our external examiner in the mid to late 70s. So I got to meet her at annual exam board meetings, and I became fascinated, as many others did, by AI and Natural Man, published in 77. In the early 80s, I'd read up a bit more about AI. I'd read Turing's paper, I'd read John Searle's Chinese Room paper published in 80, and I'd read Gödel, Escher, Bach, and that was the book that changed my life, I guess. And I got that to say to Doug when he visited it sometime later, which was a great honor and privilege to have him here. Anyway, I invited Maggie to speak at a conference I was co-organizing with the University of Lille, at Lille in France. And my partner, Madeline, was there with our small baby. This was in the early 80s. And like Maggie, she was a working mother. And they spent quite a lot of time together exchanging ideas about women's careers and about bringing up small children while holding one's own in the almost exclusively man's world, which it then was and to some extent still is, although wonderfully no longer quite so much. Maggie's advice to my partner was memorable: baby down, eyes down. And that stood her in good stead through a lot of her work and us. Oh, can you show the next picture? Oh, which is, sorry, just move on a little bit. Yeah, here are Maggie's two babies as they were at her 80th birthday party. In conversation, she made clear to us that the text of her 1977 book, whose title included Natural Man, which was a kind of obligation to the publishers, it deliberately used she rather than the conventional he as its indefinite personal pronoun. And that was pretty unusual at the time, I think. And she said to us, that's one for the sisters. So my own philosophical interest in AI had begun to crystallize by this time, and I had some very useful conversations with Maggie and also with Aaron Sloman. whose role in the development of the cognitive studies program and COGS, it was enormous. I'm really sad that he can't be here today to share his memories of Maggie, his thoughts of Maggie. And he'd also been on the philosophy faculty when I was there as an undergraduate. And like Maggie, he published a book in the late 70s, The Computer Revolution in Philosophy, in which he accused us all of being racists or racialists, to use the term he used at the time, because we didn't recognize the possibility that robots could have rights because of the development of their cognitive powers and the inevitable consciousness that involved. In 1983, I organized a conference also with colleagues at Lille, but based this time in London, and I opted for the title, The Mind and the Machine. And I didn't know at the time that a workshop with a similar name had been held in Cambridge in the late 1940s with Alan Turing present, and that's again reported in the preface to Mind as Machine. At the time, there were relatively few such conferences, although I was glad to hear about the one in 1976 that you all organised, Ernest. And Maggie and Aaron gave me a list of names to invite from around the UK. And we also had quite a few good speakers, impressive speakers from France, and one American guy, a linguist recommended by Jerry Fodor, who declined our invitation to him. But instead we had the linguist Jim Higginbotham. Around that time, I was also learning how to program in AI languages, and particularly in Prolog. I could see, as a sort of philosopher interested in formal logic, that there was an interesting relationship between logic in philosophy and logic in computing. And Prolog was fascinating to me because it appeared that it had this very solid bridge between those two worlds, more directly than in other languages like Lisp, which was the primary AI-oriented language. This was at a time when most American AI academics were using Lisp. And to the fury of the Americans, the Japanese fifth generation initiative, which was aiming to enable Japan to supplant the USA as a leading country for AI, passed over Lisp and adopted Prolog instead as their base language. I don't think they got very far with it. And I think one of the reasons was the enormous new wave that came over AI. And Andy will remember well that incredible growth in fascination for neural networks, which was just beginning to slowly expand at the time. So I was visiting Sussex for a couple of years in the mid-80s, and I experienced firsthand what was then still the cognitive studies program. It was leading up to COGS, the school, which Mike has talked about, which was set up very much with Maggie's initiative. And, she was the first dean in 1976, just before I changed sex back again to Middlesex. Maggie was kind enough, actually, at the time to invite me to stay at her house in Windlesham Road. I also stayed with Mike and with Ben various times, and it emphasized how much COGS was, the cognitive studies at the time was like a village, and care was definitely part of it. I think that was a good label for you to use. Well, the room I slept in was looked over by a bearded gentleman on a giant poster. This is in Maggie's house. You just show the next slide. And it was, the label said in Russian, Karl Marx. And here it is. This is what was my sort of guiding presence during my slumbers at Maggie's house. So, well, I think Mike spoke about COGS. I was going to say a little bit about it. I think I'll drop that because you all, maybe those of you who were familiar with it, know about it anyway, will remember it. And those who don't, well, nothing much we can say here can tell you about the kind of hive mind that developed. There was almost a kind of telepathy going on via the Poplog system, the email, and the VED editing system. The way you could sort of chuck a piece of code into a text file and then immediately execute it. It was wonderful. A lot of our innovations, or the innovations that occurred, none of them are mine, became familiar to us in the computers we use now. But a lot of it kind of almost didn't predate the first elements of those, but certainly their widespread use. And when I visited COGS frequently over subsequent decades, I continued to know Maggie well, both socially and academically, and I valued her both as a senior colleague and mentor, and as a friend, and I frequently attended her lectures and seminars and presentations and meetings, both on campus and away. And I have various treasured moments from those various times over the years. One was that we discovered that we both had a deep appreciation of the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Maggie and I briefly shared an office in the early 2000s when I was teaching at Sussex for a spell. And she had sent me a note saying that she'd borrowed a book of Hopkins that I'd left on my desk. And after that time, we occasionally exchanged books of poetry, which was a great, pleasure to do with her. Maggie invited me to play piano at her 80th birthday party. So could you just go back one or two slides? That's it. Here's Maggie giving her speech, which was largely about Darwin at her 80th birthday. I was invited with Paul Hodgson, who was one of her PhD students, who wrote one of the first jazz improvisation programs on an Atari. That kind of dates it. Maybe people haven't heard of Atari. So he'd kind of pioneered AI-generated jazz. Sadly, he died a little bit after this time, so he's not with us today. Otherwise, he'd surely be here playing with his sax. We're going to play a little bit of jazz later on in memory of and some of the tunes that Maggie liked and asked us to play at that party and other things. I took Maggie to the Oceania exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2018. And there she clearly displayed a love and expert knowledge of island life and heritage in the South Pacific. Obviously, on the strength of her visits, many annual visits to Rarotonga. Her private comments to me as we went around the exhibits suggested she knew rather more than the curators about some of the exhibits. And what was nice was that there was actually a piano there, beautifully decorated by local craftsmen down in the area, and they allowed people to sit down and play it. And I was able to play to Maggie for half an hour during that visit. In later times, some colleagues and I organised regular Thursday Zoom meetings with Maggie. Blay, Pasha, Ron were regular attenders, and we had other people who came along from time to time when they could spare the time. These took place over several years, continuing through COVID, I seem to remember, and for a while when Maggie was in the Maycroft nursing home, although it got logistically a little bit difficult during that time. And obviously, sadly, it was at the closing years of her life. So her involvement was a little bit less forceful, shall we say, than it had been when we started. But it was one of the things that I treasure most about my time with Maggie, because it really was a time when I felt we were giving back some of what we'd received. So in my, I actually wrote a lot of this, a bit like Dave. Sorry, I don't know where you are, Dave. and it got sort of inserted into a collection in a online a few months ago. And when it last appeared, I said something like this. I cautiously wrote that that AI's global market value could soon reach $1 trillion unless a dot-com style reversal occurs. So right now, stock in SpaceX, a company which is largely AI based, despite its spacey name, is currently valued at 2.6 trillion or something. That's just one company. So clearly there has been a massive rise in the global value of AI. Of course, it may just be bubblicious, to use a term invented by the AI correspondent for the Financial Times, who was on the BBC Radio 4 program on the digital human a few months ago, talking about the coming AI crash. Well, I think in retrospect, saying farewell to Maggie, we're also saying farewell to an AI era, to a past where people were working in the ways that we were working here at Sussex and at other places, on projects which were interesting and fascinating and likely to lead to some fruitful research and application areas, rather than as a cluster of mega corporate projects that it seems to be so much today. And AI has really gone from a backwater to a tsunami. Maggie talked about this in her last book, AI, Its Nature and History. In the last chapter, she refers to it using the label singularity. I don't think, even though she anticipated a number of the things happening today, I don't think even she would have anticipated just how large it's become, and teetering on the brink of some incredible set of disasters which are widely predicted by various people in the world outside AI and some people within AI, including some of our more prominent members connected with Sussex. I'm thinking particularly of Jeff Hinton. So we're now at the age of what might be called hyper AI or hyper artificial intelligence. Most artifacts in history have been, in fact, hyper artifacts, in the sense of artifacts that have other artifacts involved in their creation. Maybe only primitive flints hewn out of stone picked up from the ground would count as artifacts that aren't hyper. Deep or rich hyper artifacts are those in whose creation other artifacts have played a prominent or preponderant role. And with the development of recursive AI product creation, AI itself is taking a progressively more dominant part in the creation of its own successor systems. So I think we're entering the age of hyper AI, an era where humans will progressively relinquish control. Now, Maggie, along with many others, warned about this, and we, I think, have to think about it very seriously. And I think, in a way, the best tribute we can make to Maggie is to try to do whatever we can to tell people, educate people, not within academia, but around the world, the people who, in fact, are more and more the consumers of AI, what is happening to their world and how it may be disappearing and being replaced by another one, so that we can somehow try to mobilize opinion, so that instead of just having the market dictating what we use, we can regain informed consent and, if necessary, if possible, the ability to withdraw from the technology. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's amazing. Rich history. So nice to hear all that. And now I can really hear Maggie's laugh. Thank you for that. So we're going to have a break now.